The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Dr. Elena Vasquez didn't notice. She sat hunched over her workstation aboard the research vessel Meridian, staring at symbols that hurt her eyes. Strange, flowing marks covered her screen, nothing like any human writing she'd ever seen. These weren't letters or numbers. They were something else entirely. 3 weeks earlier, everything changed when the mining crew found the wreckage near Europa. What they thought was space junk turned out to be a ship. Not human, not anything close to human. The hull was made of materials that bent light in impossible ways, and inside, they found rooms filled with crystalline structures that hummed with energy even after who knows how many years floating in the void. Elena remembered the moment Captain Rodriguez called her to the bridge. "We need your brain on this one, Doc," he'd said, gesturing at the massive alien vessel floating outside their windows. "The computer boys can't make heads or tails of what's inside." The first time Elena stepped aboard the alien ship, her skin crawled. Everything felt wrong. The corridors were too wide and too low, like they were built for creatures that moved differently than humans. The walls curved in ways that made her dizzy, and there was a smell, not bad, just alien, like copper mixed with something sweet, but it was the central chamber that took her breath away. Massive crystal formations jutted from the floor and ceiling, each one covered in those strange flowing symbols. Thousands upon thousands of marks, equations, calculations. It looked like a library, but instead of books, everything was carved into living crystal that glowed softly in the dim light. Dr. Kim, the team's language expert, had been working around the clock to decode the symbols. "It's mathematical," he told Elena during one of their late-night sessions. "Unsure of it. Look at these patterns. They repeat, they build on each other. This isn't random." Elena spent days just walking through the alien ship, running her fingers over the crystal surfaces. The symbols seemed to flow like water, one equation melting into the next. Slowly, with Dr. Kim's help, she began to understand what she was looking at. These weren't just random math problems. Everything, every single symbol, every equation, every calculation was connected to one central problem. One massive equation. That seemed to be the heart of everything the aliens had been working on. "My God," Elena whispered one night as the pieces started falling into place. They were all working on the same thing. The more she translated, the more incredible the story became. These aliens, Dr. Kim had started calling them Zephyrians after the flowing, wind-like quality of their writing, had spent centuries on this one problem. Not just a few smart individuals, entire generations. Elena found what looked like family trees carved into the crystal, showing how the work passed from one mathematician to the next, parent to child, teacher to student, one crystal formation. Particularly fascinated her? It showed the life's work of what must have been a brilliant Zephyrian scientist. Elena could see decades of progress, false starts, breakthroughs, and setbacks. The alien had gotten tantalizingly close to something important before their work was taken over by someone else, probably after they died. "Look at this," Elena called Dr. Kim over to her workstation. She'd been working on translating a section. That looked like a journal entry. "I think this one spent 40 years just on this small part of the equation." 40 years. And then look here, their successor spent another 30 years building on that work. Dr. Kim leaned over her shoulder, studying the symbols. What were they trying to solve? That was the million-dollar question. Elena had been working backward from the aliens' notes, trying to understand what the central equation actually represented. The math was unlike anything humans had developed. It dealt with concepts that didn't even have names in human mathematics, but slowly, very slowly, she was beginning to see the shape of it. The equation seemed to describe relationships between space and time that human science could barely imagine. It talked about folding reality, bending the fabric of the universe itself. If Elena was reading it correctly, the Zephyrians had been trying to figure out how to manipulate space-time directly. The implications made her head spin. This wasn't just theoretical physics. This was practical engineering on a cosmic scale. The ability to fold space, to move instantly across vast distances, to manipulate time itself. It was the kind of technology that would make faster-than-light travel look like a child's toy. But here was the strangest part. The Zephyrians never seemed to solve it. Elena found layer after layer of work, generation after generation of brilliant minds tackling the problem, but no final answer. The equation remained tantalizingly incomplete. Despite what must have been thousands of years of effort, Elena found herself wondering about these alien mathematicians. What drove them to spend their entire lives on a single problem? She imagined Zephyrian children growing up knowing they would inherit their parents' life work, that they would spend their days staring at the same equations that had consumed their ancestors. The dedication was both inspiring and terrifying. Elena had devoted her life to mathematics, but nothing like this. The Zephyrians had approached the problem with a methodical precision that was almost inhuman. Every possible pathway was explored. Every theoretical branch was mapped out in exhaustive detail. They left nothing to chance, no stone unturned. Late at night, alone in the alien ship, Elena sometimes felt like she could sense the ghosts of those long-dead mathematicians. Their passion was carved into every crystal, their frustration visible in the crossed-out equations and started-over calculations. They had been so close so many times, but something had always eluded them. As the weeks passed, Elena became more and more obsessed with the problem. She found herself staying up later and later, puzzling over the alien symbols until her eyes burned. The equation was like a puzzle with a million pieces, and she was slowly, painstakingly putting them together. Captain Rodriguez started to worry about her. "You're pushing yourself too hard, Doc," he told her one morning when he found her asleep at her workstation. "This thing's been unsolved for thousands of years. It's not going anywhere." But Elena couldn't let it go. There was something about the way the Zephyrians had approached the problem that bothered her. They were brilliant, no doubt about it. Their mathematics was elegant and precise. But there was something almost mechanical about their thinking. Something that felt rigid and inflexible. Humans, Elena knew, were Messier thinkers. They made intuitive leaps, relied on hunches, used approximations when exact answers were too difficult. It was considered a weakness in mathematical thinking, the inability to be perfectly precise and systematic. But as Elena studied the Zephyrian work, she began to wonder if that human weakness might actually be a strength. The aliens had been so thorough, so methodical, that they might have missed something obvious. Something that required not just precision, but creativity. The thought excited and terrified her in equal measure. Could a human really succeed where an entire alien civilization had failed? Was she being ridiculously arrogant to even consider it? Elena looked around the crystal chamber at the carved equations that represented millennia of alien genius and made a decision. She was going to try. Elena's days aboard the Meridian fell into a strange rhythm. Wake up, grab coffee, head straight to the alien ship. She barely noticed the meals the crew brought her, barely registered the concerned looks from her colleagues. The Zephyrian equation had become her entire world. 3 months into her obsession, something clicked. Elena was sitting in the alien crystal chamber, surrounded by thousands of years of mathematical work, when she realized what had been bothering her about the Zephyrian approach. They were too perfect. Every calculation was exact. Every step was verified 3, 4, sometimes 5 different ways. The aliens had explored every possible branch of the mathematical tree, documenting failures and successes with equal precision. It was beautiful work, but it was also exhausting to follow. Elena pulled up one of her favorite sections on her tablet, the work of a Zephyrian mathematician who had spent 60 years on a single component of the main equation. The alien had approached the problem like a master craftsman, chiseling away at the mathematical stone one tiny chip at a time. Every move was calculated, every decision backed up by rigorous proof. "You never took a guess, did you?" Elena whispered to the crystal formations around her. "You never just tried something because it felt right." That's when it hit her. Humans were terrible at being perfect. They made mistakes, took shortcuts, trusted their gut when the math got too complicated. Elena had always considered this a weakness in her own work. How many times had her professors told her to show your work or prove every step? But sitting there, surrounded by alien perfection, Elena began to see her human messines in a new light. Maybe being imperfect wasn't always a bad thing. She thought about how she solved problems in her own research. Often she'd get stuck on a difficult calculation and just skip it. She'd assume it worked out and move on to see where the equation led. Sometimes she was wrong and had to backtrack. But sometimes that leap forward showed her connections she never would have found if she'd stayed stuck on the details. The Zephyrians never made those leaps. Elena could see it in their work, places where a human might have said, "Let's assume this works and see what happens." But the aliens had instead spent decades proving every tiny step. Elena started an experiment. She took one of the smaller problems the Zephyrians had worked on, something that had taken them about 20 years to solve, and tried to approach it the human way. Instead of following their methodical path, she made educated guesses. She used approximations instead of exact calculations. She trusted her mathematical intuition. To her amazement, she reached the same answer in 3 days. "No way," she muttered, checking her work again, but it was right. Sloppy by Zephyrian standards, full of shortcuts and assumptions, but mathematically sound. Elena felt a thrill of excitement mixed with something like guilt. Was she cheating somehow? The Zephyrians had put in honest, rigorous work. She was just winging it. But as she continued her experiment, trying the human approach on more and more Zephyrian problems, a pattern emerged. Time and again, her messy, intuitive methods found solutions faster than the aliens' perfect approach. Not better solutions, often the Zephyrians' answers were more elegant and complete. But Elena was getting to the heart of problems in a fraction of the time. Dr. Kim found her one evening, hunched over her tablet with a wild look in her eyes. "Elena, you've been in here for 14 hours straight. The captain's starting to worry you've lost your mind." She looked up at him, grinning. "Kim, what if being imperfect is actually an advantage?" He sat down beside her, concerned. "What are you talking about?" Elena showed him her work from the past few weeks. "Look at this. The Zephyrians spent decades on problems I can solve in days. Not because I'm smarter, I'm definitely not smarter, but because I'm willing to be wrong." Dr. Kim studied her calculations, frowning. "These solutions, they're not complete. You're making assumptions here and here." "Exactly." Elena's excitement was infectious. The Zephyrians couldn't make assumptions. Look at their work. They had to prove everything, verify everything, make sure every step was absolutely perfect. But sometimes you don't need perfection. Sometimes you just need good enough. She pulled up the main equation, the massive problem that had consumed Zephyrian civilization. What if they got so caught up in being perfect that they missed the simple solution? What if there's a shortcut they never saw because they were too busy taking the long way around? Dr. Kim looked skeptical. "Elena, these beings were incredibly advanced. Their mathematics is beyond anything humans have achieved. You really think they missed something obvious?" Elena was quiet for a moment, staring at the crystal formations around them. "Remember when you were a kid and you'd lose something you were looking for? Sometimes you'd search everywhere, turn the house upside down, and then find it sitting right where you left it. Sometimes we miss obvious things because we're looking too hard." She turned back to her tablet, pulling up a section of the equation that had particularly puzzled her. "Look at this part here. The Zephyrians spent 200 years working through this mathematical branch. 200 years. But what if you just ignored this part entirely?" "You can't just ignore part of an equation, Elena." "But what if this part doesn't matter? What if it's like calculating the exact number of atoms in a rock when all you need to know is that it's heavy enough to throw?" Elena's fingers flew over her tablet as she sketched out her idea. Instead of following the Zephyrian path through the complex mathematical landscape, she drew a straight line across it. Not through all the difficult terrain, but around it entirely. The Zephyrians were mountain climbers, she said, her voice growing more excited. They wanted to reach the summit by conquering every peak along the way. But humans ... Humans would just walk around the mountain if there was a path. Dr. Kim watched her work, still skeptical but intrigued despite himself. Even if you're right about their approach, Elena, this equation is beyond anything we understand. The mathematics involved. It's describing reality at a level we can barely comprehend. Elena nodded, but her eyes were bright with possibility, which is exactly why the human approach might work. We don't understand it well enough to get bogged down in the details. We're ignorant enough to try the impossible. She thought about her professors back on Earth, brilliant mathematicians who had taught her that rigor was everything. Show every step, prove every assumption, never take shortcuts. Those lessons had made her a good mathematician. But maybe, in this case, being a bad mathematician, at least by academic standards, was exactly what she needed. Elena looked around the crystal chamber one more time, at the testament to alien genius that surrounded her. Thousands of years of perfect work. Brilliant minds that had approached an impossible problem with dedication and precision that humans could barely imagine. And yet the problem remained unsolved. I'm going to try something crazy, Elena told Dr. Kim. I'm going to solve this equation the wrong way. Dr. Kim shook his head, but he was smiling. You know what? I think you're just crazy enough to pull it off. Elena grinned back at him then, turned to face the greatest mathematical challenge in the galaxy. It was time to be human. The hyperspace jump was scheduled for 0800 hours, but Elena barely noticed the announcement over the ship's intercom. She'd been awake for 36 hours straight, fueled by coffee and pure determination. The main equation sprawled across 3 monitors in front of her, a maze of alien symbols that seemed to mock her efforts. For weeks, she'd been applying her human approach to different sections of the problem. Some breakthroughs came easily, elegant shortcuts that bypassed years of Zephyrian calculations. Others hit walls that seemed impossible to climb. But Elena kept pushing, driven by a feeling she couldn't quite explain. She was close to something. She could feel it. The ship's engines hummed to life as the Meridian prepared for its jump to the next system. Elena barely registered the familiar vibration through the hull. She was too focused on a particularly stubborn section of the equation that dealt with what the Zephyrians called dimensional folding. Even with her shortcuts and approximations, she couldn't make the math work. All hands prepare for hyperspace. Jump in 60 seconds. Came Captain Rodriguez's voice over the comm. Elena rubbed her tired eyes and leaned back in her chair. Maybe she needed a break. Maybe 36 hours was too long to stare at alien mathematics without rest. But every time she tried to step away, the equation pulled her back. It was like an itch she couldn't scratch, a puzzle piece that was almost but not quite in place. 30 seconds to jump? Elena stood up and walked to the observation window. Outside, the stars hung motionless in the black void of space. In a few moments, they would blur into streaks of light as the ship folded space around itself and leaped across impossible distances. It was technology that humans had developed only recently, based on theories that had taken centuries to understand. 10 seconds. The ship's hyperspace engines reached full power. Elena felt the strange sensation in her stomach that always came just before a jump, like falling and floating at the same time. Jump initiated. The stars outside exploded into motion. What had been points of light became brilliant streaks that seemed to bend and curve around the ship. Elena had seen hyperspace jumps hundreds of times, but something about this one was different. Maybe it was her exhausted mind, or maybe it was all the time she'd spent thinking about space and time and dimensional folding, but she found herself really seeing the jump for the first time. The stars weren't just moving. They were bending. Reality itself was being twisted around the ship, folded like a piece of paper so that distant points touched each other. Elena watched the light bend and flow, and suddenly something clicked in her mind. "Oh my God," she whispered. She ran back to her workstation, her heart pounding. The section of the equation she'd been struggling with, the dimensional folding part, she'd been thinking about it all wrong. The Zephyrians had approached it as a purely theoretical exercise, working out the mathematics of how spacetime could be manipulated. But Elena realized they were missing something crucial. It wasn't just about the math. It was about perception. Elena's fingers flew over her keyboard as she pulled up the problematic equations. What if the observer, the person or being doing the folding, wasn't separate from the process? What if consciousness itself was part of the equation? The Zephyrians had treated dimensional folding like a mechanical process, something that happened to space-time from the outside. But Elena was realizing that it might be more like dreaming. When you dream, you don't build the dream world piece by piece. You simply experience it, and it exists. What if manipulating reality worked the same way? Elena started scribbling. Notes, her exhaustion forgotten. The human approach wasn't just about taking shortcuts in the math. It was about approaching the problem from a completely different angle. Where the Zephyrians saw mechanical precision, humans might see intuitive connection. She thought about how humans navigated their world. They didn't calculate the exact trajectory of every step when they walked. They didn't compute the precise angle needed to catch a ball. They just did it. Their brains processed thousands of variables instantly, below the level of conscious thought. What if space-time manipulation worked the same way? What if the Zephyrians had been trying to consciously control something that was meant to be intuitive? Elena dove back into the equation with renewed energy. Instead of trying to solve each component with mathematical precision, she started treating the whole thing like a pattern recognition problem. She looked for the underlying rhythm, the hidden structure that connected all the pieces. Hours passed without her noticing. The ship had long since completed its hyperspace jump and was cruising toward their next destination, but Elena was lost in her work. She was making connections now, seeing relationships between different parts of the equation that the methodical Zephyrian approach had missed. Dr. Kim found her sometime after midnight, surrounded by crumpled papers and empty coffee cups. Elena, you look terrible. When's the last time you slept? She looked up at him with wild, excited eyes. Kim, I think I've got it. Not the whole thing, but I think I understand what went wrong. She gestured excitedly at her screens. The Zephyrians were trying to solve this like an engineering problem. Build the perfect machine, input the right variables, get the desired output. But what if it's not engineering? What if it's more like art? Dr. Kim sat down beside her, trying to follow her reasoning. Art? Think about it. When a painter creates a masterpiece, they're not calculating the exact wavelength of each color or the precise angle of every brushstroke. They're working with intuition, with feeling. They see the whole picture in their mind and then make it real. Elena pulled up a section of the equation that she'd been working on. Look at this. The Zephyrians spent decades mapping out every possible pathway through this mathematical space. But what if you don't need to map it? What if you just need to jump? She showed him her latest work. Where the aliens had built elaborate mathematical bridges between concepts, Elena had simply leaped across the gaps. Her solutions were messy, full of approximations and intuitive guesses, but they worked. It's like the difference between reading a map of a city and actually walking through it, Elena explained. The Zephyrians made perfect maps, but they forgot that the goal was to reach the destination. Dr. Kim studied her work, his expression growing more amazed by the minute. Elena, if you're right about this, if this approach actually works, then we might be able to do something the Zephyrians never could, Elena finished. We might actually solve their equation. She leaned back in her chair, suddenly aware of how tired she was. But beneath the exhaustion was a deep sense of excitement. She was close now, really close. All those years of mathematical training, all that time learning to think precisely and logically, and the key to solving the universe's greatest equation. Might be learning to think like a human again? Elena looked at the crystal formations around her, imagining the alien mathematicians who had worked here so long ago. They had been brilliant, dedicated, and methodical. But they had also been trapped by their own perfection, sometimes. Elena realized the best way to solve an impossible problem was to be just foolish enough to try the wrong approach. And humans, with all their messy, intuitive, imperfect thinking, might be exactly the right kind of foolish for this particular puzzle. The breakthrough was coming. Elena could feel it. Elena stared at her completed work, hardly believing what she was seeing. After 72 hours of non-stop calculation, approximation, and intuitive leaps, she had done it. The equation that had consumed an entire alien civilization for thousands of years was solved. Her solution wasn't perfect by Zephyrian standards. It was full of shortcuts, educated guesses, and mathematical approximations that would have horrified her old professors. But it worked. The numbers balanced, the relationships held together, and most importantly, it actually described a process. From manipulating space-time. "I need coffee," Elena muttered, realizing she hadn't eaten or slept in 3 days. But she couldn't bring herself to leave her workstation. The solution glowed on her screens like a treasure map to the impossible. Dr. Kim found her an hour later, slumped over her keyboard with a half-empty coffee cup cooling beside her. "Elena? You look like death warmed over." She lifted her head, grinning despite her exhaustion. "Kim, I did it. I actually did it." He looked at her screens, trying to make sense of the sprawling mathematical notation. "You solved it? The whole thing?" "Well, sort of. It's not the elegant, perfect solution the Zephyrians were looking for. It's more like a really good shortcut." Elena stretched, her back aching from hours of hunching over the computer. "The question is, does it actually work?" Dr. Kim raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, does it work?" "It's a mathematical equation." Elena pulled up a section of her solution. That made her stomach flutter with excitement and terror. "Kim, this isn't just theory anymore. If I'm reading this correctly, my solution actually describes how to manipulate space-time. Not just understand it, actually do it." The implications hung in the air between them. Dr. Kim sat down heavily in the chair beside her. "You're saying this is ... what? Instructions? More like a recipe? And we have all the ingredients." Elena gestured around the alien ship. "The Zephyrians built this place as a laboratory. Look at these crystal formations. They're not just storage devices. They're quantum processors more advanced than anything we have on Earth." Dr. Kim looked around the chamber with new eyes. What he'd been thinking of as alien art was actually sophisticated scientific equipment. "Elena, if you're right about this, we need to tell the captain immediately." But Elena was already lost in thought, studying the technical specifications embedded in her solution. "It's incredible, Kim. The equation doesn't just describe space-time manipulation, it makes it possible. According to this, we could fold space, manipulate time, maybe even..." She trailed off, the magnitude of what she was suggesting hitting her. "Even what?" "Even change the fundamental nature of reality itself." They sat in silence for a moment, both grappling with the weight of Elena's discovery. Finally, Dr. Kim spoke. "We should run some simulations first. Test your solution in a safe environment before we do anything crazy." Elena nodded, but her hands were already moving over her keyboard. "I can set up a small-scale test using the ship's quantum lab. Nothing dangerous, just enough to see if the theory holds up." What Elena didn't mention was that the quantum lab was directly connected to the alien crystal processors. She told herself it would be fine, a tiny test, carefully controlled. What could go wrong? The test chamber was about the size of a closet, lined with sensors and quantum field generators. Elena spent hours programming the parameters, double and triple checking her calculations. She was going to attempt the smallest possible manipulation of space-time, just enough to measure, nothing more. "All systems green," reported Dr. Kim from the control room. "Are you sure about this, Elena?" She took a deep breath. "As sure as I can be without actually trying it." Elena activated her solution. For a moment, nothing happened. The quantum field generators hummed quietly, the sensors showed normal readings, and Elena began to think she'd made a mistake somewhere. Then reality hiccup PD. It was the only way. Elena could describe what happened next. For just an instant, maybe a tenth of a second, the test chamber seemed to fold in on itself. The walls bent inward, the air shimmered, and the metal sample she'd placed in the center of the room suddenly existed in two places at once. "Elena, Dr. Kim's voice cracked over the intercom. Something's wrong. The temporal sensors are going crazy. Elena stared at the readings streaming across her screen. What she was seeing should have been impossible. According to the instruments, the metal sample had briefly existed 1 second in the future and 1 second in the past simultaneously. Time itself had been twisted around the object. Shut it down, she yelled, frantically hitting the emergency stop controls. The quantum field collapsed, and reality snapped back to normal. The metal sample was back where it belonged, existing, in only one time and place. But the readings were unmistakable. For a brief moment, Elena had actually manipulated time. Dr. Kim burst into the test chamber, his face pale. Elena, what the hell just happened? The sensors detected a temporal anomaly. The whole ship felt it. Elena slumped against the wall, her legs suddenly weak. It worked, Kim. The solution actually worked. Worked? Elena, you just broke the laws of physics? Not broke them, bent them. Elena looked at the readings again, still hardly believing what she was seeing. The equation ... It's real. It's actually real? Captain Rodriguez's voice boomed over the ship's intercom system. All senior staff to the bridge immediately. We've detected some kind of spatial distortion. Elena and Dr. Kim exchanged glances. The test had been small, carefully contained, but apparently not small enough to go unnoticed by the ship's sensors. As they made their way to the bridge, Elena's mind was racing. The implications of what she'd just accomplished were staggering. Humans now possessed the theoretical knowledge to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality. But with that knowledge came a terrifying responsibility. On the bridge, Captain Rodriguez was studying readings that made no sense. According to our instruments, we experienced a localized temporal distortion about 10 minutes ago. Lasted less than a second, but it was definitely real. Anyone know what might have caused that? Elena stepped forward, her heart pounding. Captain, I need to brief you on something, privately. An hour later, Elena sat in the captain's quarters, watching Rodriguez pace back and forth as she tried to process what Elena had told him. So let me get this straight, he said finally. You've solved an alien equation that gives us the power to manipulate time and space. And you tested it without telling anyone. The test was completely safe, Captain. Small scale, carefully controlled. Elena, you made time go backwards in my ship. Elena winced. When he put it like that, it did sound pretty reckless. Sir, I understand your concern, but think about what this means. We've just made the greatest scientific discovery in human history. Captain Rodriguez stopped pacing and looked at her seriously. Elena, I've been in space long enough to know that the greatest discoveries are often the most dangerous. Tell me honestly, what happens if this knowledge gets out? What happens if every government, every corporation, every terrorist group on Earth gets their hands on technology that can manipulate reality itself? Elena had been trying not to think about that question, but now it hit her full force. She'd been so focused on solving the puzzle that she hadn't considered what solving it actually meant. I don't know, Captain, but I think we're about to find out. Rodriguez sat down heavily in his chair. God help us all. Elena couldn't sleep. For 3 days after her successful test, she'd been lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her quarters and thinking about what she'd unleashed. The equation was solved. The secret to manipulating reality itself was sitting on her computer, waiting to change the course of human history. But was humanity ready for that kind of power? She kept thinking about Captain Rodriguez's words. What would happen when this knowledge reached Earth? How long before someone weaponized it? How long before space-time manipulation became just another tool for those who wanted to control others? Unable to bear another sleepless night, Elena made her way back to the alien ship. The crystal chambers felt different now that she understood what they really were. Not just a library, but a laboratory where an entire civilization had grappled with the same questions that now kept her awake. Elena settled into her usual spot and began digging deeper into the Zephyrian records. She'd been so focused on the mathematical equation that she'd barely explored the cultural and historical context surrounding it. But now, with the weight of her discovery pressing down on her, she needed to understand what the aliens had been. Thinking what she found changed everything, buried deep in the crystal formations. Hidden among layers of mathematical notation, Elena discovered something that made her blood run cold. The Zephyrians hadn't failed to solve the equation. They'd solved it centuries ago. Elena stared at the alien symbols, translating them over and over to make sure she wasn't making a mistake. But there it was, carved into the crystal in flowing alien script, a complete, elegant solution to the space-time manipulation equation. Not her messy, approximation-filled approach, but a perfect mathematical proof that would have made any human mathematician weep with envy. But if they'd solved it, why had they kept working on it for hundreds more years? Elena dug deeper, following the mathematical trail through generation after generation of Zephyrian scientists. Slowly, a story emerged that chilled her to the bone. The Zephyrians had solved the equation during what appeared to be their golden age. They'd achieved everything Elena had just accomplished and more. They'd learned to fold space, manipulate time, and reshape reality according to their will. For a brief period, they'd been gods, and it had nearly destroyed them, Elena found records of what the Zephyrians called the time of chaos. With space-time manipulation technology in the hands of their entire civilization, reality itself had become unstable. Different groups had tried to reshape the universe according to their own vision. Time loops had formed. Parallel realities had collided. The very fabric of existence had begun to unravel. The Zephyrians had realized, almost too late, that they weren't ready for the power they'd unleashed. Some beings were simply too dangerous to give the ability to rewrite reality. So they'd made an extraordinary decision. They'd hidden their solution and pretended they'd never found it. The endless mathematical work Elena had discovered wasn't a failed attempt to solve the equation. It was an elaborate fiction, designed to hide the fact that they'd already succeeded. For hundreds of years after their near-catastrophe, Zephyrian mathematicians had continued to work on the equation, adding layer after layer of false complexity to bury the real solution deeper and deeper. They'd turned their greatest achievement into their most carefully guarded secret. Elena sat back, stunned by what she'd learned. The aliens hadn't been unable to solve the equation. They'd been wise enough not to. Dr. Kim? Elena called over her communicator. I need you to come to the alien ship, right now. 20 minutes later, Dr. Kim found Elena surrounded by crystal formations, her tablet displaying page after page of translated Zephyrian text. Kim, I was wrong about everything. The Zephyrians weren't failures. They were the smartest beings in the galaxy. She showed him what she'd discovered, the hidden solution. The records of the time of chaos, the deliberate deception that had lasted for centuries. Dr. Kim read the translations in growing amazement. They solved it and then hid it? Why would they do that? Because they understood something I didn't. Some problems are too dangerous to solve. Elena gestured at the crystal chambers around them. This whole place isn't a monument to failure, Kim. It's a monument to wisdom, the wisdom to know when to stop. Dr. Kim was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. So what does that mean for us? For your solution? Elena had been wrestling with that question for hours. I keep thinking about what Captain Rodriguez said. About what happens when this knowledge reaches Earth. The Zephyrians were apparently a peaceful, unified civilization, and even they couldn't handle this power. What chance do humans have? She thought about Earth, a planet still divided by nationalism, religion, and resource conflicts. A species that had barely learned to cooperate on a global scale. How would humanity react to technology that could literally reshape reality? But Elena, Dr. Kim said carefully, you can't just pretend you never solved it. The knowledge exists now. You can't unknow what you know, Elena nodded. That was the heart of her dilemma. She couldn't go back to ignorance, but she also couldn't, in good conscience, hand humanity the power to destroy itself. What if there was a third option? Elena said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. What if we could hide the solution, like the Zephyrians did, but in a way that would only reveal itself when humanity is ready? Dr. Kim looked intrigued. What do you mean? Elena pulled up her solution on her tablet, studying the complex mathematical structures she'd created. The Zephyrians hid their solution behind false complexity, but what if we did the opposite? What if we encoded the real solution in a way that can only be unlocked when humans have achieved a certain level of wisdom? She began sketching out her idea. Instead of simply hiding the equation, she would embed it in a series of philosophical and ethical puzzles. To unlock the solution, future humans would need to demonstrate not just mathematical ability, but also the kind of moral development that might make them worthy of such power. Like a test, Dr. Kim said, understanding. Exactly. The equation would only reveal itself to a humanity that had learned to work together, to think beyond short-term gain, to consider the consequences of their actions. A humanity that had grown up. Elena spent the next week developing her plan. She would publish her work, but not the complete solution. Instead, she would create what appeared to be an incomplete proof, with the missing pieces hidden in a series of ethical frameworks that would require genuine wisdom to solve. The real solution would remain locked away until humanity demonstrated that it had learned the lessons the Zephyrians had learned the hard way, that some power was too great to wield without wisdom, and that the greatest strength sometimes lay in restraint. On her final night aboard the alien ship, Elena sat among the crystal formations one last time. She thought about the Zephyrian mathematicians who had worked here, creating their elaborate deception to protect their species from its own success. They had sacrificed their legacy of genius to ensure their survival. Elena opened her personal files and began deleting her work. Not all of it. She would keep the partial solution, the incomplete proof that future humans might someday finish. But the complete equation, the one that actually worked, would disappear. As she worked, Elena felt a strange sense of peace. She was following in the footsteps of the greatest mathematicians in the galaxy, beings who had been wise enough to know that some solutions were too dangerous to share. When she finished, Elena stood up and took one last look around the crystal chamber. Tomorrow they would return to Earth. She would publish her partial findings and return to her regular research. To the outside world, she would be just another mathematician who had made an interesting but incomplete discovery. Only she would know that she had solved the greatest puzzle in the universe and then chosen to lock it away. The equation would wait, patient and hidden, until humanity was truly ready for its power. Elena smiled and walked back to her ship, carrying the weight of cosmic knowledge and the wisdom to keep it secret.